Hello and welcome to The World Today. We're going to discuss this evening with Greg Grandin, whose latest book, Kissinger's Shadow, The Long Reach of America's Most Controversial Statesman, came out some months ago and has been both well received but also controversial. Greg is a professor of history at New York University, and we're very glad to have him with us on the show. Now, Greg, let's start with the basics. What on earth made you want to go into libraries and God knows where else to dig out stuff on Henry Kissinger? What was the motivation for the book, which I enjoyed very much, by the way, but what made you do it?
Well, I work primarily on Latin America, so I've written on Kissinger in his role in Chile and in Argentina, other places. And about 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe at this point 4 years ago, a newspaper asked me if I would write his obituary. Newspapers have these have these advances, ready to go. And I thought maybe it would be good to do create a new genre, a people's obituary of Henry Kissinger. But that title, though, a people's obituary, I think it requires a level of snark that I wasn't quite capable of. And even though I did pursue the subject, I got a little bit deeper into more real issues. Mainly how the misrecognition of Kissinger as a realist says a lot about the U.S. About U.S. American exceptionalism, Americanism, the ideology in which the U.S. justifies itself. I do think that his career, both first as a foreign policy intellectual, then as a policymaker, and then as a kind of neoliberal power broker / pundit, does capture something about the sweep of American power from the 1950s through to today, and particularly how it connects the Vietnam War to the Iraq War, right? There hasn't been a lot of good work that makes that fullness of that case. And Kissinger, I think, was a good window onto that history.
As you've discovered subsequently, I was amongst a group of 3 people from Oxford who debated Henry Kissinger before he was even known. He was just a professor at Harvard. And there was no doubt whatsoever that we won that debate hands down, and it was on the Vietnam War and its future. We were not very impressed with Kissinger, and then when he emerged on the world stage, I thought, my God, this guy was completely deceptive. No one would have thought at that debate of ours that he would reach such heights, but clearly he wasn't promoting himself that much, arguing a certain case. But your picture of him, of course, is pretty amazing. I mean, the way in which he used his position with the Democrats to infiltrate himself into the Vietnam peace negotiations and then reveal what was going on to Nixon, who was the Republican candidate, and help prolong the war by 3 or 4 years or however long it was. I mean, that is a shocking act, actually.
By this point, he had been a kind of informal advisor to, I mean, he was Rockefeller, a kind of...
Yeah, he was Rockefeller's man.
He was Rockefeller's advisor. But he had contacts in the Johnson administration, and he saw himself as an establishment foreign policy intellectual. And yet he basically passed on information to the Nixon campaign that Johnson had reached reached an agreement that they would enter into formal talks after the election, and Johnson would do a bombing halt. And Nixon used that information to channel that information back to South Vietnam and get them to balk and nix the deal. And that was the end, and the war continued for 5 more years. And hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians, died as a result. And by the time Kissinger negotiates an end to the war in '73, it's on terms that were basically on the table in '68. And why that's important in and of itself, I mean, in and of itself it's important, right? It's a crime, it's immoral, it's horrendous, and speaks volumes to Kissinger's striving that he's willing to sacrifice these countries for his own political position. But it really is key to everything that happens afterwards. Once they take power, then Nixon and Kissinger have to figure out a way to get North Vietnam back to the bargaining table. And they can't just start bombing North Vietnam because there wasn't political will. So they start bombing Cambodia.
Instead.
But they have to bomb Cambodia in secret because they're afraid of the backlash. That secret bombing creates this culture of paranoia within the White House that eventually leads Nixon and Kissinger to in all sorts of tapping their reporters, the phones of reporters and politicians and their own staffers. It's Kissinger that basically goads Nixon into setting up the plumbers, which of course then leads to his downfall with Watergate. So in some ways, everything kind of spins out from that original crime, which is interesting.
The North Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Van Dong, I think, remarked as Watergate got going and Nixon resigned to avoid impeachment. He had a very interesting remark. He said that the road to Watergate led through the battlefields of Vietnam.
Yeah.
That had we not won our victories, had we not exposed their lies, there would have been no Watergate.
No, and the original articles of impeachment included the illegal bombing of Cambodia, and yet a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans scotched that. And so the articles of impeachment just had to do with the domestic crimes around the burgling of the Watergate Hotel. So it's a way in which this kind of imperial amnesia works very strikingly and very clearly. Watergate is transformed into a domestic crime or into a crime of Nixon's arrogance or Nixon's paranoia, when it was really just a crime of imperial war and militarism and intervention, right? It goes to the heart of the content of the policy, not just the form of Nixon's craziness.
Of course, Kissinger himself has been known to joke, or say in a half-jokey way, but just half-jokey way, that, of course, many people in my own country regard me as a war criminal. So he's perfectly well aware of what he did in Vietnam, Cambodia, and at the same time, roughly, Chile. The toppling of the Allende regime was his masterstroke, planned with his help, and we saw what Chile went through. So what I'm curious about, Greg, is this. Everyone knows what you and I are talking about and what you've written about at length. I mean, much of it was known at the time. And yet, despite all this, this guy recovers his standing, is feted by conservatives and liberals and heads of states alike, is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, together with the Vietnamese negotiator who refused to accept it, to his enormous credit, and said, if you're giving it to this rogue, I don't want it. But why has nobody, I mean, even liberals, he was invited a few years ago to a party, a Nation party, for instance, just to give you an example of a magazine we both know and like. And so he, what is it with the American liberal establishment, leaving aside the conservatives, that somehow they've transformed this sort of tawdry war criminal into a celebrity?
Part of it speaks to the deeper structural amnesia of American militarism, and there's part of it is that. Part of it has to do with the specificity of Kissinger in the Nixon White House. And because he was able to weather and survive Watergate and continue on to the Ford administration, I think that was key. And then under Ford, he begins he kind of culminates what he becomes celebrated for, détente and rapprochement with China.
China,
He
yeah,
becomes
that
the-
was a master
talking
move,
about
yeah.
interdependence and, the shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. Some of this happened under Nixon, but he becomes all of the stuff that he gets celebrated for. And then he becomes attacked by the new right, and he's able to use that among liberals, I think, as a way of shoring up his credentials. And then part of it, I think, continues with the right-wing drift of the Democratic Party. It's the Clinton administration that rehabilitates him.
Yes.
For the Democrats. I mean, Clinton wanted a kind of serious Republican tutor to show that Clinton had gravitas. Kissinger was also very key in negotiating NAFTA under the George H.W. Bush administration, going back to something we just talked about. And Kissinger helped Bill Clinton get NAFTA passed through Congress, the Kissinger Associates. So there's ways in which there was a convergence among neoliberal Democrats and the rehabilitation of Kissinger. That shtick that he pulls, the gravelly voice, Bavarian accent, even though he's been in this country since he's 13, and his brother, who is younger than him, had lost the accent. His older brother had lost his accent a long time ago. But I think that I think people fall for that. And this goes back to the original point, why this book. I think that Kissinger's is useful to think with and think about U.S. militarism for a number of reasons. One, alone among other foreign policy giants that helped design the early Cold War or justified the early Cold War, he is the only one that never repents. Arthur Schlesinger as a liberal, George Kennan as a conservative, Niebuhr as a religious theologian. They all begin to have doubts about U.S. militarism, whether it's over Vietnam or over Reagan. Kissinger remains steadfast in his certainty.
Defends himself.
Yeah. Well, he never apologized.
He never
and
apologized.
I think that the philosophical origins of that refusal to apologize that's one of the things that I tried to unravel in the book. Kissinger was an existentialist. I mean, if you read his undergraduate thesis, it reads like Sartre. I mean, there is no meaning except the meaning in the world, except the meaning that we as individuals give it. Now, the thing is that existentialism would have a huge impact on the new left generation, but it usually led people to oppose war.
Exactly.
Kissinger cobbles out this kind of, what I call this kind of imperialist existentialism that justifies more and more war, right? It's just, the will to act. And he draws, he's misrecognized as a realist or a real politica, but, he's very much influenced by a kind of German subjectivism, a German romanticism that fetishizes or celebrates a kind of will to act. Not waiting for information, not waiting for intelligence, not letting the past kind of put shackles on us, right? So Kissinger's whole philosophy of history, he clearly argues against a cause and effect understanding of history, that that X policy produces Y consequence. He very, very clearly argues against the notion of blowback, because statesmen can't let themselves be paralyzed by what happened in the past. They have to confront the current crisis and act on it. And to not do that is an abdication of responsibility. This is his, and so if you actually look at his writings throughout the course of his whole political career, he's held pretty clearly to this kind of subjectivism, this kind of relativism.
What you say about him, wouldn't that apply almost in the same way to another foreign policy thinker, probably just as arrogant as Kissinger and just as influential, certainly in the Carter administration, Brzezinski, the grand chessboard? I mean, he also plays the same game. So how would you compare these two figures? I mean, Kissinger is obviously more fated, more powerful, projects himself better, but Brzezinski played a similar role, did he not?
Brzezinski and Kissinger had, they had a long-standing rivalry that goes back to Harvard, right? And they both kind of swam in the same waters. And if you go back and read Kissinger, not just his undergraduate thesis and not just his graduate thesis, but his writings through the 60s and 70s, it's fairly clear that his whole philosophy of history is that you can. It's drawn from Spengler, Oswaldo Spengler, a German historian, philosopher from the early 20th century that had a whole, cycles of civilization rise and decline. And so Spengler argued that you can know you're on the precipice of decline when the bureaucrats take over, when the number crunchers take over, the accountants take over, when the priests and the poets and the warriors and the philosophers lose power, when empires or civilizations know they can project power, but they forget why they are projecting power. They lose their sense of purpose. So Kissinger borrowed that analysis, but this is where the existentialism comes in. But he believed that decline wasn't inevitable, that great men could intervene at key moments and bend the curve upwards. Right? If they had if they embraced the emptiness and meaninglessness of life. Brzezinski, I don't think came. I mean, I don't think
he didn't think in such.
Yeah, he didn't think in those terms. And part of the book is to show the way Kissinger actually sets the table for the neoconservatives. Because part of the story foreign policy pundits tell themselves is that Kissinger represents the kind of realist half of the polarity, and the subjective neocons, Wolfowitz and Cheney, who they were the true Spenglerians, or they believed that you didn't have to have information before you act. There's that great quote that was attributed to a Bush staffer that we now know as Karl Rove. That was taken as the height of neoconservative arrogance, that, we're an empire now, we make our own reality. And, and you're a reporter, and as you're writing it down, we're going to act again and make new reality. Well, Kissinger in 1963, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, said, there are two kinds of realists: ones that operate within the realm of realism, and another one that make their own reality. And what we need now is the second kind. So he said it.
I mean, that in itself, Greg, as you know, begs the question: we are now an empire? I mean, this is something very recent. Manifest Destiny completely forgotten, Woodrow Wilson completely forgotten. It's almost as if the collapse of the Soviet Union made them an empire. It's true, it made them the only empire in the world, and that was very unusual. But I mean, American imperial history stretches back to the foundation of the country. Now, what is the attitude of Donald Trump to Kissinger? Because this, even though Kissinger is 91 or 92, surely he's going to be invited to the White House to kiss hands, Greg, or some other part of the anatomy.
Kissinger, right after the election, was all over Trump. He was selling Trump as, we got to give him time, we've got to see. Because in many ways, Trump is this kind of, if Kissinger was a proponent, and it's associated with Nixon, it's associated with other game theorists of the madman theory, right? You have to project unpredictability in order to make the threat real. If you come across as a bureaucrat, or if you come across as somebody who doesn't project unpredictability, then you can't. Then you're basically giving away your negotiating power. So in some ways, Trump is the fulfillment of this, right? I mean, so Kissinger was out there pretty much everywhere right after inauguration. He kind of disappeared after Trump went off the rails about China, about Taiwan, and or
he's trying to row back from that a bit, isn't he?
Yeah, I don't know where Kissinger's been. He's gone to ground. Might be part of the whole brokering with Russia, and obviously there's some of that. But then where he stands on China is a little unclear. But he's gone to ground, and I haven't seen him. I haven't seen any. He hasn't been showing up as in the newspapers in the last couple of weeks. I don't know where. I don't know what his stance is on Trump.
It would be ironic, really ironic, if Kissinger, who played a huge part in Nixon's turn to China, and it was a very clever move to offer the Chinese a lot of things and break them definitively from any bloc or friendly relations with the Soviet Union. So much so that even in foreign policy terms, the Chinese were backing really reactionary forces in Angola, upsetting the Vietnamese, waging war against the Vietnamese to pierce the myth of Vietnamese invulnerability and failing to do so. So that whole Nixon-Kissinger turn to China was in global terms a huge success. And it would be ironical if now, seeing that China has become too powerful economically, they try and do a deal with Russia to try and prevent any relations between Moscow and Beijing. I'm just thinking aloud, really. There's not much evidence, but it wouldn't totally surprise me if that's the way some of the foreign policy establishment was thinking. Not the crazies who see Russia as a huge threat, which it blatantly isn't. It's nothing like the power it used to be.
Right. Yeah, and going back to Kissinger would be par for the course, because Kissinger, even if we want to grant him those successes, détente with Russia, rapprochement with China, he immediately begins to ally with the new right, which undermine certainly détente with China. He began to normalize relations in Southern Africa and withdraw support from white supremacy, but then he aligns with the Reagan Revolution, which accelerates the war in Mozambique and Angola, which devastated those countries and restarted the Cold War. So there's ways in which that even if we want to grant him these achievements, there's ways in which he immediately undermines them as he positions himself vis-a-vis U.S. domestic politics. That's the other thing about Kissinger that makes him useful to think with, is that with every lurch to the right of U.S. militarism, not only is he not repentant, he lurches with it. So he goes from Rockefeller to Nixon, even though he thought Nixon was insane. And he went from Nixon to Reagan, even though he thought Reagan was
not all there.
Yeah, not all there. He went from Reagan to the neocons, even though the neocons had come into power, attacking everything that Kissinger tried to do during the Ford administration. So there's ways in which you could chart the drive to the right by tracking Kissinger's career.
The one thing we can't, of course, forget are the laws of biology, Greg, because he is 93 years old.
According to the actuary table, he's got 3.6 years left. So, so that means he might be eulogized by Donald Trump.
Well, that would be very fitting, I think, if that happened. But, Greg, when did this process start of foreign policy thinkers? You mentioned George F. Kennan, amongst others, of them becoming really major figures. Kennan was, of course, very well known, and he played a huge role, and he was incredibly reactionary at the beginning of the Cold War. Some horrendous things were said by him. But he never reached the same status as Kissinger in terms of a all North American or global perspective. Of course he was known, but not like this guy, traveling everywhere, buzzing around, meeting heads of state here, there, and there. When did this tradition start of these thinkers acquiring mobility, if you like? Becoming upwardly mobile. Brzezinski did that to a certain extent, but Kissinger outreached them.
But Kissinger really is the archetype of that, isn't he? He really is he really does fuse his own career with the career of U.S. militarism in a way. And in some ways, that's what makes him quintessentially American, right? He is a product of meritocracy, as the meritocracy is instantiated through the national security state. He's a Jewish immigrant that came to the country when he was 13, that works his way up through Army intelligence, and he basically comes to take over the foreign policy establishment from the old WASP, Cambridge, Washington corridor, right? His triumph and ascension within that says something about how the national security state is a meritocracy to some degree. But I think Kissinger is unique. I mean, Kissinger was unique in the sense also because Nixon empowered him even before they were inaugurated to create a National Security Council that took power from defense, took power from state. And so the National Security Council prior to that was really just an advisory body. It was like the National Economic Council. Nixon wanted foreign policy to be concentrated in the White House, not in the State Department, not in the Pentagon. And he told Kissinger to come up with a plan that would do that, and he did. And there is a qualitative jump in what the National Security Council is prior to Kissinger and what it is after. You know, how he's able to parlay that. I mean, part of that does have to do with his charisma, his ability to be kind of quintessentially American, but somehow come off as being outside and being, you know, with this
in the tradition of Metternich and
and all of that.
Yeah.
So, and then he creates Kissinger Associates, which is this premier neoliberal consultancy that is key, you know, plays a key role in the privatization of Latin American industries in the 70s and 80s, and you know, whatever he's doing in China, whatever he's doing in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, you know, so he builds a power base there. And then even as he has basically carte blanche to go into CBS and NBC and ABC and, you know, CNN and become, you know, offer his, become a color commentary on whatever it is.
Amongst the younger generation of foreign policy thinkers, if we call them that, Greg, can you see anyone remotely like him?
No. I think he was of his moment. I think, and that moment is also key, and we didn't really talk about this, is that Kissinger both accelerates the breakup of the old national security state that comes out of the early Cold War and is destroyed by Vietnam, and he helps preside over its reassemblage in a new form capable of moving forward in a post-Vietnam world. And you know, there's a number of different elements of that recomposition. Part of it is the increasing reliance on covert operations. Part of it is increasing, the increasing reliance on spectacle, you know, and this kind of will to act. Another key component of it is the way in which foreign policy becomes completely subordinated to domestic polarization. Now, in the past, presidents had used foreign policy to position themselves, in terms of elections or whatever. But Vietnam really changes the balance. The bombing of Cambodia had as much to do with trying to bring back Hanoi to the bargaining table as it had to do with placating Ronald Reagan and movement conservatives in the U.S. As foreign policy creates these divisions within domestic society, increasingly foreign policy is used by politicians to leverage those divisions for their own political benefit. And I think Kissinger is key in this transition from the old security state, which was based on elite consensus, on planning, on mass support, you know, for the most part, to a post-Vietnam national security state, which assumed political polarization, domestic polarization. That's another reason why Kissinger is a useful figure to think with and I don't think there's anybody else. I mean, nobody else plays that role, and nobody else is able to leverage that for his own personal benefit in terms of wealth and in terms of prestige.
So, are you working on a new obituary?
Yeah.
Given that you written this book,
keep updating it.
you have to update it.
Yeah, well, definitely. Yeah. Well, I mean, when I wrote it, I thought that, you know, the epilogue was basically about how Barack Obama's drone wars and his global counterinsurgency. The takeaway was how Democrats had rallied behind Kissinger, but now obviously, you know, there's a new chapter with the Trump administration.
Yeah, which we don't know how this is going to end. Right. Greg, thank you very much, and congrats on the book.
Thanks, Derek. It's really great to speak with you.